measure of how an economy is doing. The Bureau of Labor Statistics is the office in the Department of Labor that keeps the records. They actually keep several different kinds of unemployment statistics. The most interesting one is not the one you hear about, how many adults are without work looking for work, a number that's about 10% these days. The most interesting is what they call U-6. If you go Google them, you can find out about it. That's a number that is a much better measure. Here's what it measures: the number of adults looking for work unable to find it, plus the number of people who have a part-time job only because they can't find a full-time job and they want one. And the third group added in are those who used to be called discouraged workers and are now called, in a change of name that ought to give you pause, marginalized workers. These are the people who've stopped looking. They don't have a job, but they're not looking anymore. When you add these three together, U6, 17.5% of the American working class is in one of those three categories. 1 out of 6, every American family has somebody in its circle of husband, sister-in-law, uncle, cousin, who's in that situation, which means as they run out of their savings, which we didn't have much to begin with, become burdens on the rest of the family, making sure that the unemployment problem becomes a problem for everybody. Last year, we had 1 million people thrown out of their homes. We're scheduled to have 1.5 million thrown out of their homes this year. That means we're a country in which we have, side by side, millions and millions of people without a home, and millions of homes without a resident. Remember, the system we live in is called capitalism. And what I've been describing is what it delivers. The mass of people unemployed, real wages continuing to be flat to trending down. Nothing prevents wages from going up so much as having millions of people looking for work that will be ready to work at less than whatever it is you're paying the people who already have the job. We have no recovery for the mass of people. We haven't had any. The tragedy in America is only that the masses of people who are not participating in the recovery, by reading about it in the press every day, think the fault lies with them as individuals rather than in a system that produced this crisis in the first place and now can't fix it and hasn't a clue. Now, I promised you at the beginning I'd give you examples of how things could have been done differently. Let me do a little of that. Number one, easiest. Why in the world is there no federal program to hire the unemployed? Let me just remind you of American history for those of you that are not up on it. In 1934, Franklin Roosevelt went on the radio and he said to the American people in a speech the following: if the private sector in our economy either cannot or will not provide jobs to Americans able and willing to work, then there's no alternative but for the government to do it. Between 1934 and 1941, 11 million people were hired by Franklin Roosevelt to go to work. They had, let's go through it, they had meaningful work. They produced outputs. The national parks, many of our bridges, lots of outputs. They did reclamation of the land before ecology was a sexy term. They did useful work that everyone in the country has benefited from. They felt much better about themselves because they had a job. And because they earned an income, they could maintain their mortgage payments and didn't have a housing crisis on top of an unemployment crisis. The interesting thing in our culture is not only that we didn't do that this time, but the fact is that the president of the Democratic Party, which was Roosevelt's party, and a Congress controlled by the Democrats in both houses, not only didn't do it, they never debated the idea. And you're telling me there's no alternative? Those millions of people would have been working. They would have had the money to spend to buy the goods that would give other people jobs. We might not have gotten ourselves out of the crisis, But we haven't done that with this program of bailing out the banks either. It's an extraordinary record of what was not done. Here's a second example. Why were the wages allowed not to continue rising after the 1970s? The productivity went up. There was more wealth being produced. The workers had shared in it by rising wages the previous 100 years. Why not afterwards? Where is it decreed and written that that couldn't have been done, wouldn't have been done, shouldn't have been done? It isn't. That's a function of how our society works. Let me begin to bring this to an end, sad as it is. Over the last year, we are in the next phase of this bizarre comedy. Here's how it works. Everywhere, governments bailed out private capitalist enterprises by spending massive amounts of money, mostly to help their financial industries. You ever wonder to yourself, where'd they get the money? In the heady months of September 2008 to June 2009, nobody worried about it. The Congress of the United States passed the bills spending the trillions. Well, there's only three ways the government can get the money. It either taxes people, or it prints it, or it borrows it. And what governments everywhere did was borrow it. And they did that for a very simple reason. If you taxed the mass of people, A, you would have had a revolution, I'll put that one aside, but you wouldn't have gotten very far because every nickel you were taking from the people would be that much less they spent. So if the government helped, it would be shooting itself in the foot. It would cancel itself out, so they couldn't do that. It wouldn't work that way if, of course, if they, here comes, taxed corporations and the rich. There might have been a good argument for that if you think about it. Why? Well, let's see. Between 1970 and 2007, as every measure of income distribution and wealth distribution in America shows, the top 5% of the people ran away with it. We now have an unequal distribution of wealth. After World War II, the United States had less of a gap between rich and poor than most Western European countries. Now we outdistance them. We have the greatest gap. The rich have done fantastically well. Thought, if there's a crisis for the nation, maybe you go to those most able to pay. We didn't. Number two. They're the ones who arguably did a good bit of what brought us to the crisis. So maybe there's a certain, I don't know, justice to it. Let them pay for it. Let me give you an example, just for those of you that might be skeptical. I'll do a little economics with numbers. That often overwhelms people's skepticism, especially in this culture. Merrill Lynch keeps track of what are called rich people, but they don't call them that because that's crude. They're called HNWIs, and that stands for High Net Worth Individual. So you are now aware of something, probably of a club you are not a member of. You are a high net worth individual if you have stocks, bonds, and cash of at least $1 million. That is above what your house is worth or anything else, that's not counted. Just your portfolio of stocks and bonds. If you have $1 million or more in that, you're a high net worth individual and therefore of great interest to Merrill Lynch. There are, in case you have ambition, also ultra high net worth individuals, and those are those for whom that portfolio is at least $30 million. So using the numbers that Merrill Lynch carefully collects, here's a little calculation I made. The last year for which we have total numbers, 2009, how much did the government borrow? Roughly $1.5 trillion. So I asked myself, the government could have avoided borrowing if it taxed the rich. And I said to myself, let's see about these high net worth individuals. How much do they have here in the United States? $12.5 trillion. Okay. So a little over, I don't know, 10%. 10% of their wealth. How many of them are there? 2.8 million in America. So less than 1% of our population. We could have gone to 1% of our, less than 1% of our population, taken 10% of what they have in a portfolio, not touching their home or any of their possessions, and it would have allowed the government to do everything it did in the height of the crisis and not borrow one penny. Why is this important? Because in the world as it is and in this country, the government didn't do any of that. It didn't tax the rich. Instead, it borrowed all the money. And because it borrowed all the money, it now confronts a situation in Washington and in all 50 states and in all cities that it has an enormous interest cost. It has to pay interest on all that borrowing. And that means a huge portion of the taxes you and I pay to the city, to the state, to the federal government is not used to provide any service we need or want, but rather the government functions as a collection agency. It collects it from us and passes it on to those who lent to the government. And here comes the best part. Who lends to the government? Well, the answer is obvious. The only people with the resources to lend to the government are the people who weren't taxed, who instead of paying a tax to the government, lend the money to them. At this point, if we had more time, I'd stop speaking and simply play the national anthem. But we don't have the time, so you'll have to imagine the Star-Spangled Banner without. Wealthy people are confronted in an economic crisis with two choices. You either have to part with some of your wealth to get us through this crisis, or, alternative, you don't get taxed. You lend it to the government, which uses the money to bail out the crisis, and then pays it all back to you with interest. Which one would you choose if you were wealthy? Well, guess what the government did? It did the one they chose, the one they preferred. That might be all right, but now what do? The government has to pay the interest. The government has to reduce the debt so the interest charges aren't so high. So everywhere, governments are turning to the mass of people and saying, gee, we have this crisis, and the government's budget is all out of whack. And the people that lent to us are very anxious, and they're saying they're not going to lend any more to us because we're too indebted. We're like a person's borrowed too much. And so we can't afford, we have to lower what our debt is. And so, dear citizen, we're either going to have to tax you more to raise the money to pay off the debt, or we're going to have to cut back the services so the money we used to spend, I don't know, let's say for, Medicaid or state colleges, is reduced, and that money can now be used to pay down the debt. This kind of a program around the world, even in America, is called austerity. See, you do have a good sense of humor. Austerity is a wonderful word because it sort of implies that we're all in this together, and we all have to push and pull through the hard times that will allow us to get out of it. So I hope I don't offend anyone, but not being from this state, I can afford this. I listened in stunned disbelief to your new governor the other day, explaining to all of you how you're going to have 5 more years of those emergency taxes that you passed in 2009, and that's about 12 billion, if I understood his numbers, and another 12 billion will come from cutting. And what were the 2 big areas to cut? For the poor people, massive reduction of Medicaid. And for the middle, massive cuts in the budgets of the community colleges, state colleges, and the university system. You're all going to get to live in a society which a week ago we